So yesterday, the United States floated a plan to end the war that Ukraine said, thanks, we hate it. And Russia said, that's just going to lead to more escalation. So, overall, seems like we're not at all on the right track. But let's dive into what this plan looked like. I'm going to pull up this map here. This was according to an interview that General Kellogg did with the Times, talking about how Ukraine could be divided up like post-World War II Berlin. I think it's best to start with this map where we have this kind of Western coalition in the West here with United Kingdom, France, and Ukraine. He was very clear in saying that there would be no United States troops on the ground. I guess Ukraine gets the privilege of keeping the northeastern portion of their country, and then Russia takes the east with an 18-mile wide demilitarized zone cutting through that territory, essentially in the Donbass down through Zaporozhye and then stopping at the Dnieper. So, can't imagine why Ukraine didn't like this one. And Russia as well said, hey, this is actually just going to lead to a larger conflict down the road. But let's dig into the details here. So again, turning to this article with the interview with General Kellogg, it says, quote, General Keith Kellogg, a leading figure in U.S. efforts to end the three-year war, suggested that British and French troops could adopt zones of control in the west of the country as part of a reassurance force with Russia's army in the occupied east. Between them would be Ukrainian forces and a demilitarized zone. Quote, you could almost make it look like what happened with Berlin after World War II, when you had a Russian zone, a French zone, a British zone, and a U.S. zone, he said. Now, I should mention that immediately after this came out, there was a lot of pushback. A lot of people not happy with what they saw here, understandably so. I think the most common take that I saw from the Ukrainian side was summed up well when they said if the solution to end the war was giving up territory and giving in to Russia, we don't need the United States help to do that. And that's essentially what it's looking like here, is just giving in to Russian demands does not require a third-party arbiter of those negotiations. Now, General Kellogg, there's enough pushback here that General Kellogg felt the need to address this article, saying that it was taken out of context. He said, quote, the Times article misrepresents what I said. I was speaking of a post-ceasefire resiliency force in support of Ukraine's sovereignty. In discussions of partitioning, I was referencing areas of zones of responsibility for an allied force without U.S. troops. I was not referring to a partitioning of Ukraine. So kind of some nuance there, but I understand where they can get to the partitioning from what he said, especially the conversation about how this could be similar to what things looked like after World War II. Now, I know right away a lot of people came out just dunking on General Kellogg here, but he does have some moments here in these conversations with Witkoff and Putin later on that it shows they're on starkly different pages, and it does seem like Kellogg is arguing more in favor of supporting Ukraine, whereas Witkoff is a little bit more, from my perception at this point, in agreement that we should just give more to Russia and try to meet more of the Russian demands. Now, continuing on in this article, they say there are clear differences between Kellogg's proposal and the partition of Berlin and Germany after the Second World War. While Germany was forced to surrender to invading armies, Ukraine would be inviting allies to provide a reassurance force in the west of the country, and there is no suggestion that any further territories would be handed to Russia. That seems like it's still up for debate. And I'm going to pull up a map here to show you where the confusion comes in all of this. We're using a deep state map in this case. Now, the partition essentially along the Dnipro, and then we've got the 18-mile demilitarized zone running across the front lines here. But the issue that runs in, and we've talked about this before, is there are territories that Russia has claimed responsibility for, Luhansk right here, Donetsk right here, they do not yet control. So the major question here, or down here in Zaporozhye, we've got an area controlled by Ukrainian forces and then an occupied area by Russian forces. So if that line cuts right through here, what does that mean? Does that mean that Russia is ceding portions of this territory that they have claimed control over? They're voluntarily going to let portions of the Russian Federation go under Ukrainian control? You see how that might not be appealing to Russia? So it's asking them to cede, and we really haven't asked Russia to cede anything at this point. So that, of course, would be notable. And then from the Ukrainian side, they're saying this is all illegally annexed territory at baseline. What do you mean we have to give any of it up? Now, shifting back over to the article here, they did talk a bit about elections where General Kellogg said, quote, "I think if you get to a ceasefire, you're going to have elections. Because now it's been almost a year since they should have been called. They weren't called, but I think Zelensky is open to do that once you get a ceasefire and once you get some resolution. But that's a call for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian parliament, not ours." This was a major issue a couple months back. Maybe it was more recent than that, where people were presenting Zelensky as an illegitimate actor in trying to negotiate some sort of end to this war. And Putin is running that as best he can, saying, hey, I would love to negotiate. I just can't negotiate with somebody who's not legitimately in charge of their country, which is nonsense. And we've made videos here talking about how this is Ukrainian law. They're under martial law. They're not going to have elections in the middle of a war. And if they want to, they can change that law and hold those elections. The United States was speaking a different tone earlier, and it was a little frustrating because for all of the criticism we get for meddling in foreign elections and foreign governments, this, to me at least, was a direct call to meddle in foreign elections and say, I know you don't want to have an election and your law says you shouldn't have an election. We're telling you, have an election. Nonetheless, it looks like General Kellogg here is saying, just give it time, wait for the ceasefire to come about, and then we'll get there. Now, while the same day all of this came out, Steve Witkoff was in Moscow actually meeting with Putin. We've got a couple videos and clips showing their meeting there, and a couple articles outlining what went down there. Reuters says U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has told President Donald Trump that giving Moscow ownership of 4 occupied Ukrainian regions would be the fastest way to achieve a ceasefire. And that's citing 2 unnamed U.S. officials and 5 other undisclosed sources. So, of course, take that with a grain of salt, the undisclosed sources, unnamed sources. But according to those same sources, Reuters says that Trump administration officials are increasingly divided on how to break the deadlock in Russia's war against Ukraine, with Witkoff and U.S. Special Envoy Keith Kellogg disagreeing on the best path forward. And this is important here. They say Kellogg has argued that Ukraine would never agree to unilaterally cede total ownership of the territories to Russia. And that seems to be this major split. I want to go back to the map here to show you some of these areas that, again, I feel like this is one of those things that from the outside looking in, maybe folks that had not been paying attention to the conflict or had not been keeping up with it, this seemed like a clear-cut answer. And I've talked to friends of mine that are engaged in U.S. domestic politics, and this wasn't a top 10, 20, 50 issue for them during or after the election. And all of a sudden they started talking about it and saying, well, I've got the idea. It's simple. Guys, listen, I don't know why nobody's thinking about this. Russia gets to keep what they've taken. And that is so much easier said than done in a lot of ways. First off, that at baseline strips any Ukrainian agency away from this process, which I think is a problem. We need to probably lead with what Ukraine wants to do in this case in terms of what the actual ceasefire looks like. But again, this little detail that so many folks seem to look past is that Russia does not control the entirety of these territories. So you're going to upset someone, whichever way you do it. Either portion of that is segmented off and Russia gets to keep what they have illegally annexed at this point, or even more is moved back to the border here of Donetsk, and we're just going to give Russia more territory that they actually haven't taken yet. So again, I think what we're seeing more and more is people that maybe had not been all too focused on kind of the nuance and the challenges in this conflict running up against some of the realities on the ground. Now, turning to the response here, by and large, Russia doesn't like it at all. Now, on the Ukrainian side, I should mention that I haven't seen any official Ukrainian sources, government sources, come out talking about these plans or Witkoff's meeting. But there's been some very large, very pro-Ukrainian accounts that are just hammering this, very, very upset. And again, kind of speaking to this point that if you're just going to cede territory and give in to Russian demands, why do we even need the United States to be a part of that? We can do that ourselves, is kind of the Ukrainian take, and I understand that. Now, turning to the Russian response here, I'm going to butcher the name here. Rodion Miroshnik, the Russian foreign minister's ambassador at large, had an interview here with TASS, Russian media, where he said, quote, by keeping the militarization zone there and the formation of radicalized elements is one of the options of freezing, which may be later implemented through a new level of escalation. The period of time for the Kyiv regime to heal its wounds may be very short indeed. They gathered, analyzed the previous experience, prepared themselves, and pumped tens of thousands of troops through Great Britain again and deployed them to the battlefront once again. So his argument, and we've heard this from Russia time and again, and Ukraine makes this argument in the other direction as well. I think it's a valid concern for either side to have here. I think the Russian one is a bit overblown. But the argument that a ceasefire is just a time for the other side to re-equip and rearm. That's always the issue. in a ceasefire. Now, from the outside looking in, I would say that Russia has much greater capacity and capability to do that in the short term than Ukraine, especially as U.S. military aid is likely coming to a stop, if not slowing down significantly. But nonetheless, that's the Russian argument here, is we cannot allow Ukraine time to rebuild their armed forces. And we should note that just a couple weeks ago, on March 12th, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the presence of NATO troops under any flag in any capacity on Ukrainian soil is a direct threat to Russia, adding that Moscow would not accept this under any circumstances. So, General Kellogg in his meeting here talked about how Ukraine is being very flexible and very open to trying to find some way to bring about a ceasefire. On the other side of this, we have Russia saying, hey, everything you're presenting is a showstopper. We can't accept anything right now that has been put on the table, to include, again, this talk of any sort of peacekeeping force. Doesn't matter if they're flying under a NATO flag or not. If there are any Western troops at all, no go from the Russian point of view. So, again, we've got this whole plan being laid out, and seems like nobody likes it. I'm not sure if we're looking for some sort of durable peace. I mean, there's an argument at times that if you're negotiating between two parties and both of them leave not happy, that maybe you found the correct middle ground. But when you're talking about the possibility of a conflict that could re-spark at a moment's notice, I'm not sure you want upset parties on both sides of that ceasefire line, if you will. Now, turning to some of the more informal sources here, looking at Russian military bloggers, military informant said, quote, "It should be noted that such a plan completely contradicts Russians' repeated statements and demands for control over the four regions in the absence of foreign troops in Ukraine." Two majors said, quote, "It is unclear how this differs from the threats to national security described in our doctrinal documents, such as bringing NATO infrastructure closer to Russian borders. The proposal looks like a deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine, but under the guise of peacekeepers." And then Alexander Kotz said, "Somehow I don't remember part of Berlin remaining for the Third Reich." So kind of a mixed bag there. By and large, they're viewing this as a secret deployment of NATO troops or European troops to Ukraine, so Ukraine can build up their forces and once again go back to attacking Russia, I guess, or defending their territory is probably another way to look at it. And Alexander Kotz there suggesting, hey, maybe we should take Kyiv. If World War II Nazi Germany didn't get to keep Berlin after the war, why does Ukraine get to keep their capital? Is kind of the take of Alexander Kotz there. But again, by and large, this is the details, the most significant details, I would say, that we've seen in any terms of ceasefire agreement since these negotiations have begun a couple months ago. But as of now, from my perspective at least, it looks like both of these kind of ideas are kind of dead on arrival, but we'll keep an eye on them.